So welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Frances Bottenberg, and I am the General Education Assessment Coordinator here at UNC Greensboro. And prior to this role, I was a full-time faculty member in the philosophy department for 7 years, and I also served as the MAC faculty fellow in the very first year of our new Gen Ed program, Minerva's Academic Curriculum, or MAC. So I'm really, really pleased to be hosting this meeting and to see so many folks coming out to hear about what we were able to collect in terms of student learning data in our new program. I also want to mention that we are going to be joined by some other people that I have the pleasure of working with quite a bit on MAC-related issues, and that is Jessica McCall, who is our General Education Council Chair. We also have Jody Pedizzoni, who is our Director of Assessment and Accreditation, and is also one of the co-chairs of the Implementation Committee for the MAC program. We also are joined by Laura Pipe, who is the Director of the University Teaching and Learning Commons, UTLC. And I also should mention that Lynn Wyrick is here, who does all things Gen Ed Council and Curriculum and is fabulous in so many ways. She's here with us, as are Amy Brown and Stephanie Guzman, who are also in the UTLC with Laura and have been working to assist in all kinds of MAC workshops over the years. So thank you all for being here, and thank you everyone else for being here. We have an audience that partly consists of faculty and instructional staff who have been asked to participate in the student learning scoring last year, and you're here sort of probably because you're curious about what we found in the aggregate. So welcome. And then we also have advisors here who are generally curious about what's happening. And also we have other faculty and staff and administrators joining us to get a sense of what is happening in terms of student learning in the new Gen Ed program. So welcome everybody. I'm going to ask that we hold our questions until the end of the initial presentation. You can type your questions into the chat. You are welcome to do so as we present some information to you at the first part of the hour. Please do write your questions in the chat. I believe Jody, yes. Okay, Jody is going to be monitoring the chat. And if anyone posts a question that in Jody's view really needs to be addressed in the moment, you have my full permission, Jody, to interrupt me. Once I have my slides up, I will be more or less oblivious to the chat. And so please do just interrupt me. That is fine. And we will address any questions on the spot that are clarification questions. Other than that, we'll handle questions at the end of the hour. And not just that, we have some initial discussion prompts that we can work through as a group. And then we want to make sure there's a few minutes to talk through questions that you're bringing today to this opportunity, this gathering. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. That's a funny place to start. Let's go back to the beginning. Let me just make sure. Can everybody see the screen clearly, the slides? Excellent. Okay. So we're here today to talk about student learning assessment results from the 2021-22 academic year and last year, 2022-23. Now, these forums have been a consistent feature of our campus since 2011. They are part of the assessment process that we conduct here on campus in relation to Gen Ed. There was a hiatus of a few years as we transitioned from our old Gen Ed program to this one. So it's really nice to be resuming this. So what I mean that it is part of the assessment process, the feedback that you all provide us today will be featured in summary form in the final report that is generated for our assessment results from the MAC from last year. So know that your contributions will be part of what we consider qualitative feedback from the campus community and specifically faculty who are looking at some of these results with us as well. So very quick, a little bit of context. I know some of you are familiar with this, but others are not. So let's get on the same page. Why do we assess general education at UNCG? There are several reasons. MAC in particular is a new program. It did launch in fall 2021, so we are entering our third academic year in this program. So it is important that we are very diligent about looking at what our students are in fact learning or seem to be learning in this program. Also, our accrediting body, SACS-COC, has a specific accreditation principle related to general education, and part of that principle has us focus on explaining to them and showing to them how we continuously monitor and think about student learning in the general education program. And so this is something we do in order to collect information, to collect data, and to collect feedback from the stakeholders in Gen Ed so that we can create those accreditation narratives that are expected of us. Also, assessment definitely supports faculty-driven conversation and also other members on campus who are deeply committed to student learning in our Gen Ed program. And that's because we here at UNCG, we do have a very faculty-driven process. It is a course-embedded process. And I'll say more about that in a minute. One of the really important sort of visuals to keep in mind when you think about our assessment process at UNCG, we are always asking three interrelated questions. We are asking, are MAC students learning what we want them to learn? Do the MAC SLOs continue to reflect what we want the program to deliver? And are the MAC rubrics serving their purpose effectively? So those are the three connecting questions. And in what you see, once you look at some of the numbers and the feedback, you will perceive, I think, that these three questions are sort of always at the foreground of why we're doing what we're doing. As I mentioned, our assessment process here is faculty driven, and you might ask, well, what's another alternative? Well, another alternative is that external standardized tests would be involved to judge student learning in Gen Ed, and this is before my time, but Jody and I have talked about there were some experiments with this in the past, and they didn't go well. And as an instructor myself, I can completely understand what the issue might be with bringing in standardized tests into our classrooms. So what we have going here at UNCG is a situation where, and you see this in the top left of the graphic, course instructors, we reach out to a 20% sample approximately of the course instructors teaching in a focused competency in a given semester. They are invited to select the assignments in their courses that they think best demonstrate learning of all of the SLOs of the MAC competency that their course is designated to deliver. So instructors select those assignments. If they want guidance or they want a sounding board, I am here for that, as well as the other wonderful people that I mentioned at the start of the meeting. So there's always room to sort of confer about the options that are available in terms of picking those assignments. Once the assignments are selected, the MAC relevant assignments, as it were, the course instructors are given a rubric and a score sheet, and they are asked to score all of their students' submissions for those assignments and enter those aggregate scores into the score sheet. So it's all aggregate numbers that we are provided with. The next step is that a small sample of student work from each of the course sections that are included in a given semester, a small sample of student work from each of those sections is provided to peer colleagues who are also teaching in that MAC competency and who have expertise in delivering those SLOs. They are asked to score those student work samples using the same rubric and using the same aggregating process as the course instructors did. But of course, they're scoring small samples of student work across many different course sections, and so they have a very different view of the information as they're scoring. So those are the sort of parallel processes, if you will, that are used to collect the scoring data that we'll have a look at in a minute. And then what happens is next, the assessment coordinator, and that's me, assembles the data and creates a report, and the General Education Council will have a chance to review that report after we have these forums this week and add some more feedback into that report. Gen Ed Council will look at it and ultimately approve it, hopefully, and then it gets published on the assessment website of our university. So it's a publicly available document. And I should also say that we are recording today in part because we want to be able to share this conversation as well publicly. So it will be posted either on the assessment site and or on the MAC website and the general education website. And we go in that cycle. So that is the process. Now, there was mention of MAC rubrics. So very, very quickly, again, some of you are familiar with this. We have MAC rubrics for each of the 11 MAC competencies. Faculty groups, and in some cases including expert staff members as well, got together in year zero, so the year before the MAC was launched, and created rubrics. Last year, the rubrics were revised by faculty groups. And so now we have all 11 MAC rubrics posted on the MAC website. The address is at the bottom of this screen. It is mac.uncg.edu/rubrics. So please do look at these rubrics, and Jessica sends out an email at the start of every term to all faculty and instructors who are teaching MAC courses with a link to the appropriate rubric. But these are essential documents for our general education program, and they are essential documents for our assessment process. And they all have a basic format that is shared across 11 rubrics. And here, what you see on the screen is an explanation of the rubric, basic terms, and then the rubric itself, which always will list the SLO that is officially associated with the competency, and levels of learning description that break down that SLO into different levels of achievement. So moving forward, and again, I hope as questions arise, please post them, and I look forward to hearing what you're thinking as we go. Switching gears a little bit, now it's time to look at what we collected. And what I have here actually is sort of putting the end first, but I don't know about you, but I like to know the ending first. So then when I look at the numbers, I have a little more context. So these 4 points are what I think are the main summaries of interpretation that can be pulled out of the data that we collected over the past 2 years. The first is that, and this is a positive, overall, the data seem to suggest that students are reaching acceptable levels of achievement in our Gen Ed program, our new Gen Ed program. Acceptable means, and this is the second point, that most students whose work was scored are scoring at or above level 2 of the rubric. And I should mention here, what you're looking at is the label descriptions of all of the levels. So you can see level 2 on these new rubrics is actually called MAC Basic Competence. These labels were not on the first versions of the rubrics, and that's significant for a reason we'll get to in a little while, but this is an important clarification that the General Education Council considers level 2 to be a sufficient target for Gen Ed. If you're having 1 3-credit class, it's your introductory exposure to a particular MAC competency, level 2 seems appropriate. The third summary point here is that instructor raters scored their students higher on average than did the peers who were involved in scoring the anonymous work samples, right? And we will look at the data on that, but that is worth noting that we saw a variance of rates across those 2 rater groups. And the final point is that we did gather written and oral feedback from all of the folks involved, so course instructors and also the peer colleagues at the rating workshops. There is a strong concurrence of opinion on this, that the MAC rubrics are actually useful for getting on the same page about what we're trying to do with this university-wide curriculum, and that more faculty and instructors could be using these rubrics when they're thinking about their assignment design before the semester even starts. Because that will, for example, increase alignment between the assignment prompts that we're asking students to think through and the actual student learning outcomes for our program. So these 4 points really, I think, in essence, cover a summary view, a bird's eye view, if you will, of what we can glean from the quantitative and qualitative data that we've collected. And so now we're going to jump into a couple of screens with numbers and lots of percentages. What you see here are all 7 of the MAC competencies that were assessed last year. I like to call them the focus competencies for the year. We do have 11 total competencies, and last year we looked at 7 of them. And they're listed in alphabetical order from the 3 critical thinking and inquiry competencies through diversity and equity, global engagement, and intercultural learning, quantitative reasoning, and written communication. At the bottom of the screen, you see the color coding for the graphs, and it is from highest level to lowest. So level 4, which in the original rubrics was called capstone, is in blue on the far left. Milestone 2, level 3, as it was called, is in the middle. Level 2 follows to the right. Milestone 1, as it was originally called. And then level 1, benchmark, is on the far right. So hopefully what sort of you can grasp from these percentages, again, is verification of the idea that most students are achieving at least level 2. Most. And you can see that plenty are doing better than level 2 by the percentages. You might notice that quantitative reasoning has a little bit of a different pattern than the other competencies. And largely that is because the sample was 100% sections taken from the math and statistics department. And they had an internal rating process that they together had decided upon. And essentially it came down to awarding a 2 if a student answered a problem correctly. And there were some provisions made for awarding a higher level of achievement, but by and large, the math problem was solved correctly. They achieved the goal, so level 2. Whereas in the other cases, you have assignments that generally, must allow more nuance in how they're being scored. These ratings don't necessarily have a lot to do with grades. And that's worth remembering. And that's actually why most folks who participate in this process end up saying it was very interesting and useful, because you are only looking at the MAC SLOs. And so you may end up discovering new things about how your students are working and how they're performing, because you're not worried about all the other things that we ask for when we're grading an assignment. You're just looking at those SLOs. In 2021 and 22, you can see the pattern is, looks kind of similar, at least for foundations and health and wellness, as with our scores from this past year. So most students achieving at least level 2 in foundations and health and wellness. Data analysis and interpretation, that 40% obviously jumps out. So 40% not reaching level 2, that would be a red flag. But what you need to know is that the first version of the data analysis and interpretation rubric actually had a different alignment when it came to defining the levels than the other 10 rubrics did. The other 10 rubrics in their original versions defined level 1 in terms of more or less a kind of failure to meet a basic objective. The data analysis interpretation, I guess the faculty who wrote this originally were just in a much more generous minded space, because they said, no, level 1 benchmark, we can define in terms of a positive minimal achievement. And so in effect, when the student work that was collected from data analysis and interpretation courses was scored, the rubric guided faculty to award a level 1 if students were essentially meeting some basic achievements. And so, in fact, you're encouraged to think of that big rating as representing, at least in part, level 2 achievement compared with the other rubrics. And you might be wondering, well, that seems like an issue. What's been done about that? Well, that was why we ended up focusing a lot of last year in revising all 11 rubrics to create a better alignment of the meaning of the levels across the 11 rubrics. And that was a big project. But because those revisions weren't completed and approved by council until May of this year, all of the assessment done in MAC so far has relied on those original rubrics. So the second summary point that was mentioned just a moment ago is that we did notice I shouldn't say significant, but there are differences between what course instructors scored their students, between how they scored their students and how the peer validators, as we call them, the folks at the workshops, scored those same student work products. I shouldn't say the same, but a sample of those student work products. We see some differences, and I've placed bar graphs here next to each other just so that you can see some of those differences pretty clearly. By and large, what we see is that the peer validators are scoring students lower than the course instructors. And I did look back at some of the reports that my predecessor, Terry Brumfeld, had compiled for GEC, our old program. And I have to say there's some similarities there. So it's not like this is a one-time effect. It is something that happens. That course instructors invited to participate in this process will tend to score their own students a little bit higher than those peer colleagues who are invited to score the anonymized sample student work. And here we see also quantitative reasoning standing out a little bit. The peer validators had a different set of rules they were following when they scored, essentially, and this is why they gave a lot more of the math sample work a higher rating, a level 3 rating instead of a level 2. If you see numbers here that you want comment on, make a note, put it in the chat. We can definitely come back to these screens. And I even have graphs that break down the SLOs, the data by SLO. So if any of you are here and you're sort of desperate to know about how a particular SLO breaks down in terms of these data, you can ask, and I'll bring you there to that slide in the Q&A. Okay. And so here again, you see the data analysis and interpretation stands out as a situation. And that is again because the validators were taking the original rubric seriously and considering level 1 as describing a basic accomplishment of the competency. Whereas in all the other cases, it was the description provided for level 1 in data analysis was more like the description provided for level 2 in the other competencies. So possible causes of these score variations, we've had to think, and trying to interpret this is important. So if you all have other suggestions, I can't really say hypotheses because I don't think we'll test them, but if you have other explanations for why this might be the case, the four that we came up with, and you've heard me speak on this already, the first one, that there were varying interpretations of the rubric levels. So because the rubric levels in the first version of these rubrics were labeled capstone and milestone and benchmark, we had course instructors who interpreted capstone to mean within the course. So the capstone achievement within this course. The actual intended meaning was capstone within the entire college career of the student. And the folks who were in the workshops got that training. They were told very clearly, Capstone 4 is a senior student who has taken multiple, iterations of a course that lets them practice these things. This is why level 2 is an appropriate score for a one-off gen ed experience. Course instructors did or did not receive that information. Training was offered. Training was also provided in writing and in a video, as well as in person. But I think that message wasn't always clearly conveyed, and it wasn't stated in the rubrics as it is now. And so I think that explains partly why we see so many capstone achievements in some of these competencies where we got to be a little skeptical of that. And also, and Jessica and I have talked about this a little bit, the truth is that many of us are, most of us are not used to someone coming in and saying, hey, can you score your students for us, and we'll collect that information. Many of us might feel somewhat judged in that scenario, and that is a reasonable reaction. And so there might be a case, a little bit of motivated perception or something like that effect involved here, where we are asked to essentially present we're asked to present the learning achievement of our students. But in the back of our mind, consciously or unconsciously, we might also be thinking, but maybe they also are going to use this to figure out if I'm doing a good job, or if this class is a good class in gen ed, for gen ed. And we had some folks who, in the writing feedback that we let them, we encouraged folks to give us, they said things like, and we're imagining a case where someone gave quite high scores to their students. They said things like, I'm not surprised by these results. I've been at this a long time. I do it excellently. My students have excellent outcomes. And this is why this is a good course for this gen ed program. Okay, this is probably an exaggerated version. It's kind of combining elements. But you can see that in some cases there was a kind of felt urgency to justify the high scores and to talk about the high scores as demonstrating something. And by the way, it may well be that we have some classes that are being taught so excellently that most of the students taking it from MAC credit are achieving level 3 or level 4. I'm not saying that's not a possibility. I know it to be true. But we may end up saying, look, when we're trying to figure out why on the aggregate, course instructor scores are quite a bit higher than the peer rater scores. The truth is there might have been a little bit of motivated perception. So I am particularly interested in your views on that as well. And finally, course embedded, when you're scoring some of your students' work within the context of your course, you just are looking at it differently than a situation where you have a colleague who is looking at the work in a decontextualized context. I'm not sure how that affects the rating. I'm not sure what sort of a result that would produce, but surely that is a different perspective. So we do have to keep that in mind. It might help explain generally why the scores between these two rater groups are not necessarily overlapping very closely that often. So the final point that I wanted to raise before we look at a little bit of feedback from instructors and peer raters is concerning the unable to rate percentages. And again, this is nothing that is specific to MAC. In the previous Gen Ed program, there were always unable to rate scores as well. What is this? Well, it's a situation where you have peer colleagues at the assessment workshop looking at anonymized student work. And what they're telling us in certain situations is this assignment prompt, in our view, doesn't actually allow the student to demonstrate this particular MAC SLO. And it would be unfair as a result to score the student. Because I mean, if the assignment isn't actually asking them to demonstrate a particular learning, then we can't score them. Now, sometimes by accident, as it were, the student would demonstrate, and so they would receive a score. But the percentages that you see on the right-hand side for the 7 focus competencies from last year, what they essentially tell us is that at least in some cases, we had significant numbers of assignments whose prompts did not align with the MAC student learning outcomes. And the way that I scored this was I looked, was there at least one peer workshop rater who said that a particular student work product was unrateable. If that was the case, I included it in the percentage. So these are a little bit, it's not the case that all the raters in a group said, oh no, I can't rate this, but at least one person did. And that's significant. We don't want to ignore that information. You can see that the scores are highest for diversity and equity and written communication. The reason that is a little bit different for each of those competencies. The reason you see such a high unable to rate percentage for the diversity and equity competency, in our view, is that the original rubric for diversity and equity included dimensions in the rubric that were not actually strongly implied by the SLOs themselves. So the rubric embedded sort of additional learning outcomes, as it were, that instructors by and large just weren't aware that these were part of the expectations. And specifically, there was a dimension for all 3 of the diversity and equity SLOs that related to students being able to, quote, interrogate their positionality in reference to, and then it would have been in reference to systems of oppression and advantage, and so on. So many faculty who were asked to provide assignments simply said, look, I don't know that this fits well. I didn't realize this was something that we were working on. So that helps explain the unable to rates. And what came out of that, and I think Gus Pena is actually on this call, and Gus was one of the folks who joined the working group for the revision of the diversity and equity rubric. That group ended up deciding that it would be better practice, it would be best practice, in fact, to make sure that the SLO text strongly implies whatever you're going to be looking at in the rubric itself. And so the positionality dimensions were taken out of the revised rubric, and the first 2 SLOs were reworded so that there's a way into talking about having students reflect on their own position and their own identities and their own construction of their identities in relation to broader systems and structures. So there's more of a clear thrust towards that. And so everybody teaching diversity and equity courses should have received an email from Jessica saying, here's the new rubric, right? And focus on those SLOs. And I think that will improve our unable to rate scores in the future for this competency. Written communication was a little different. There it seems like there are faculty and course instructors who are teaching written communication classes, but who aren't fully attending to the revision, not the revision process, but the process of reflecting on one's own writing. Because that is essential to our MAC written communication competency, is that students aren't just writing, but they're actually given opportunities to reflect, to talk, or to write about their own writing choices and their own writing process. And so that's a place where I think if if we can continue to think about our assignments that we're designing in our written communication sections and make sure there's room for that, for students to demonstrate their thinking about their writing, that will also help with this particular data collection process. And in effect, it'll help students learn the program as we intended. So nearing the end here, sampled course instructor feedback. In a nutshell, many faculty who were asked to participate basically said, look, I like these MAC rubrics, but I didn't really know about them before you reached out to me. And I know that in the future, I will adjust some of my assignments so that there's better obvious alignment, both to communicate to the students clearly, hey, this is a gen ed class, here are your outcomes. That's what we're going to be working on, but also for the process of collecting this assessment data. We can get better data that way. The other thing is that a lot of faculty participating ended up saying that they had an idea already of how to help improve student learning within particular SLOs. So that's wonderful to hear. And we also had several adjunct faculty and graduate students who teach courses say that they weren't sure about their responsibility to participate in this assessment process. And this is part of a larger conversation. And in some cases, we got to talking with department chairs as well about this. Since our gen ed program is a university, it is the university's foundational curriculum. Anyone instructing in it is considered gen ed faculty. And as such, they need to participate when asked in the sampling of student learning. Why? Because we want this to be representative. So if we say no graduate student instructors are permitted to participate, then we're actually cutting a lot of seats out of our sample, and that's a problem because we do want it to be represented. We want to know who, what are we actually all doing here together, and we are together in this. So that's part of the feedback that was provided by course instructors who participated in the process. Peer validators really emphasized again and again that the MAC rubrics seem so key to all of us getting on the same page about what we're trying to accomplish in this program. And so using those MAC rubrics and the SLOs to design our assignments will be really helpful. And then, of course, for the purpose of assessing student learning, they're really crucial as well. And the peer validators had some really pointed feedback for those of us who are behind the scenes working on assessment process and faculty development. And one of the big suggestions that came out through their feedback was how important it might be to have a kind of repository of assignments, examples of how to potentially teach and also create prompts to assess some of these MAC SLOs. And so a kind of peer-to-peer database, a fair use database, obviously, but a place where if you're wondering how you might tweak your design in your oral communication class, a place you could go and have a look at what others are doing. So that's a nice idea, and hopefully we can do that. We do have new websites. The MAC site is a new website. If you haven't checked it out, it's nice and it's going to keep being built out. So hopefully we can put those kinds of resources there or link off that site to a place where it's housed. If it's a Canvas site or somewhere else, we want to be able to link from the MAC site and the Gen Ed Council site. And also, we want to be able to use these new rubrics effectively, and we know that they will help improve some of the reliability of our raters and the normalizing of some of that data, as will consistent training across these rater groups. And the other interesting thing we're doing for the first time, we're sort of piloting some instructor tailored reports, because again and again, course instructors who participate in the process want feedback on what they've submitted. And the process that is in place at our university wasn't actually designed for that purpose. It is, as you see, completely aggregated. So it's all about sort of creating big numbers and creating a broad picture. So we're trying to think about, okay, given the process as it is, how can we give some instructor focused feedback? And do we want to just provide it, or do we want folks to reach out and ask for it? Because there's a difference. If you want the feedback, you may ask for it. And programs, academic programs other than MAC. Maybe we create reports that share some of these results with department heads and undergraduate directors so that they have access to some of these interesting spaces of learning. It is worth noting that, like with our old gen ed program, all of the MAC courses in the catalog do need to go through recertification every 4 years. And so part of that recertification has people like department chairs and undergraduate directors and the faculty who teach these classes give an argument for why this class stays in gen ed. And understanding how the class is being taught and how students are responding seems like interesting information to have. And certainly it's nice to be able to have some concrete data that can be involved in those reports for those programs. So those are some of the other things that we're trying to think through. And if you have suggestions, you have ideas, you have questions concerning any of these process tweaks, please feel free to ask them in the remaining time we have, or contact me or Jody or Jessica at any point about them. So we come now to some discussion, and we brainstormed some questions to open with, but it's sort of up to all of you who are here as participants interested in this conversation to guide us towards other questions that you want asked. So why don't we just open with these questions and hear perhaps some reflections, and we can also turn to questions that have come up in the chat at this point. So the 3 questions are students learning the MAC competencies? What can we tell from these data? What are your thoughts? So as potentially a participant, what could you add? As somebody coming in, learning about this, what could you add? And a broader question, what other questions about general education, teaching, and learning should we be asking? And so again, we are here to collect feedback. So from here on in, our last 15 minutes together, this is your space. And I believe Teams has a raise hand. Yes, Teams does have a raise hand option, like Zoom, and you're also free to unmic yourself and speak.
Francis, I'll mention that in the chat, Mara had asked the question about assessing at the end of the program, so as students are getting ready to graduate. And for those who were not department heads or were not involved in academic programs last year, you should know that we did reach out to departments and ask about how these MAC learning outcomes, these MAC competencies, are enhanced in the students' academic programs, because that was part of the component of building this program. The MAC would be foundational, but then there would be many places and many programs where students would find several of these competencies further enhanced, further delivered, and learned in their academic careers. So we do have options here. One of the options is that every academic program does assessment of learning. You're probably preparing your reports right now that are due no later than October 2nd to our office. When you have these competencies, these student learning outcomes that exist in your program, the rubrics are an opportunity to apply them to the student work in your program and collect data about that. The second opportunity that we have is to actually do an evaluation once this MAC program has been in place for the entirety of a student's career. So in a couple more years, we could reach out to all of the departments that have indicated that they enhance particular competencies in their programs, collect student work, and do another set of evaluation that's more of what some used to call a value added perception of learning in the program. So those are definitely things that we can plan on, reaching out to departments to see if they have and if they can apply these rubrics to student work, or doing a peer evaluation process that mirrors what we do at the foundational level. So thanks for that, Mara. And just in general, we are always thinking about how to evaluate this program. We're 2 years in. 2 years is early, and yet there's always opportunity to think as you are rolling this program out, are we doing it the right way? So I want to assure everyone that the General Education Council has already had this conversation. They know we've got to evaluate the program to make sure that it achieves the goals that we wanted to achieve. One of the major goals was to simplify the program for students. So we've got to go back, look at those goals and see if we're achieving it. The General Education Council, both in April and at their first meeting, affirmed that they want to do a program evaluation. They're talking about the process for the coming year with the hopes of having surveys, having focus groups, having conversations about this program. So there should be lots of opportunities in the future to help us make sure that this program is doing the most that it can. Hey, Francis and Jessica, you may see that Sudha asked a question about the DEI competency needing to be changed if there's any risk after the Supreme Court decision. It's something that we have to keep our eye on. And I know Laura's here too. Laura Pipe has had some engagement in this, and I would welcome anyone who wants to pipe in right now. We asked this question too, and we were told not to take any action right now, but we're keeping our eye on it. And if we need to respond to it, we will, but we have not gotten that guidance at this point.
Thank you. Thank you for asking, Sudha. It's a very good question.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I'm glad to hear that we're looking at some sense of a kind of standardized set of assignments that might be kind of best practices for getting at some of the new SLOs and being able to understand the difference between instructors' assessment of their own students and the assessment done after the fact by the faculty who are doing it as part of the team. It's kind of to look at atomized or anonymous evaluation, because I had the same experience back in the GEC program when I participated as an anonymous reviewer. The very same experience that a lot of assignments were unable to be evaluated because we couldn't see exactly where the SLO what existed within that particular sample. So I think that's great to hear. That's just procedural kind of feedback that I wanted to give.
And can I just clarify, the repository would be examples that people could tap into to either borrow or make adjustments to their own assignments. We haven't talked about having like canned prompts that everybody would use. So I want to make sure that everyone understands that every assignment is specific to a course, and you should be adapting and implementing assignments as necessary for your purposes.
Yeah, thanks so much for that feedback, Jamie. That's really appreciated. On Monday, we had a comment from one of the participants that, oh, this is a lot of assessment stuff. Well, I mean, that's part of why we say it's part of the assessment process, that these forums are meant to talk about the behind the scenes, because that's information you all need to know as well. But of course, we have information to share as well about what we're seeing in terms of achievement. So just directing back to these questions, I mean, what else? What are some other reactions that you all are having to this information? Are you surprised as a course instructor, perhaps, based on what we've been talking about and what you've been seeing? Or what other things do you want us as a community to be thinking about when we speak about general education learning and teaching?
Well, I would just encourage you all to share any feedback that you want to with Frances. Frances is drafting this report that will be reviewed by the General Education Council. Any interpretation that you can provide to us to allow us to engage conversation with the General Education Council would be great. We'd love to return some of this as advice and recommendations to the campus for actions and improvement. So comments about what a great job Frances did, and I just want to echo that. Frances did an amazing job putting this process together, collecting the data, structuring these reports in a way that are consumable, and that seems to really make sense. So we're so grateful to have her on her team. Terry was wonderful too and had her strengths, and Frances is just a fabulous addition to this office. So I'm so grateful that she's engaged these conversations and put together this information for everyone to share. And thanks everyone for joining us.